there is a lot that happens in this chapter. The title I've given the message today is kind of a short one and a long one. So the short version is Taking Stock of Life. Taking Stock of Life. Subtitle, or longer version, Pausing to Examine God's Work in and Around You. Pausing to examine God's work in and around you. Again, in the message today, we'll be considering the entirety of Genesis 35. In that chapter, there's a number of things that happen. Mostly, things are winding down. Journeys are completed. Vows are fulfilled. Various people die and finish their part in the ongoing drama and story of the Bible. It's a big part of what happens. However, there are also other important things just at their beginnings. Some positive things and some negative things. Positively, there is a wholehearted commitment to God, which is freshly secured in the heart of Jacob. Altars are built, promises are remade, children are born, and a family is becoming a large and prosperous clan. These things are good. Negatively, hostilities in the family appear to be worsening as the firstborn son of Jacob has sought to supplant his father's position as the patriarchal leader, and he's done so in a very crude way. This attempt is rejected by Jacob, and it remains for us at the end of this chapter to see how this controversy will play out among the next generation of Abraham's descendants, and how is it God will establish His promises among them and through them and sometimes in spite of them. This is where we are. Those things that are at their beginnings will be picked up by Moses in Genesis 37 in the Toledot section of Jacob, where Moses will tell us of what becomes of Jacob and his descendants. But right now, we're in Genesis chapter 35. And there's much for us to consider and to understand. And I want to move us through this chapter quickly and to address major issues that come up as we read. And then at the end to lay out what I think God intends for us to take away from this chapter. In the interest of time, I don't want to read through the entire passage at the outset. We'll just read through as we go section by section. Why don't we pray before we go any further? Father in heaven, admittedly this is a text it's sort of a patchwork. There's all sorts of things that get wrapped up here and get said, which are fitting conclusions to all that we've read. And we are grateful for the things that are here. I ask that you would make clear to us what it is you are saying to us in these words. What are we to gain from the stories that are recorded for us? We've gathered together for a number of things. One of the chief things is to sit under your word and to be fed by it. And so we ask you to do that for us now by your Spirit. Take these words on the page and work in us through them. Amen. Well, just a few things to say about the chapter, a few other things. The chapter divides itself into several sections, each one of them with its own purpose and part in the overall chapter. We could ask, and it would be a good question to ask, why are these stories the ones we have and not other stories? It's always a very important question to ask. As Stan was mentioning earlier as he was reviewing with the kids about the Gospels, we're talking about history with the purpose. Why did they choose the stories they chose in their telling of the life and ministry, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? They had a very specific purpose. Moses, likewise, has a purpose, both for the nation of Israel, coming out of Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, preparing to enter into the land, and for all the nation who would come after, and for new covenant believers who would come later still. There's something here for us. He has a purpose for us. So why do we have these stories and not others? Another question might be about the order of these stories. The order of these stories seems to follow Jacob's journey just as he travels. It seems to be pretty much in chronological order. There are people who kind of wonder if stories have been kind of transposed and put in different order for the sake of maybe topic, or just where else would we put it, or someone editor just put it in. And that's not really, I don't think there's any real reason for that. The chapter reads pretty well straight through as you follow his itinerary from one place to another as he journeys eventually on to Mamre near Hebron, where his father Isaac is living. We pick up, the story begins just outside of Shechem. We follow Jacob then to Bethel, and then from there eventually on to Mamre, with stops and incidents along the way. So what are these sections I'm referring to? The first one would be verses 1 through 7, where we have recorded for us the journey to Bethel, and then Jacob's worship of God there. At that place, we remember in terms of this journey, God reminds Jacob to fulfill exactly the oath that he had previously made, and this is the story of that. Then in verse 8, immediately after that, we have this emotional loss of Deborah. Deborah was the nurse to Jacob's deceased mother, or probably deceased mother. Well, Deborah herself passes away, and there's great lamentation made for her. Then in verses 9 through 15, I kind of describe it as the re-blessing and the renaming of Jacob, from Jacob to Israel. And there God confirms his promises to Jacob and his renaming him of Israel and all that means. Israel also, on his part, renames the place Bethel, and they kind of do all this again. Then verses 16 through 21, the birth of Benjamin and the death of Rachel. We could just say it this way: in the face of death, in the face of Rachel's dying, God still is continuing to build his people and establish his promise and his purpose. Then in verse 22, all by its lonesome, is a shocking event. Reuben makes a play to secure favored and prominent position among his brothers rather than leaving it to Isaac to decide. He seeks to become preeminent among his brothers and to make that official. And then the last half of verse 22 on through verse 26 is recounted for us the state of becoming a nation. The 12 sons of Israel are the seedling clan that would become a nation, and the status they have obtained so far as these 12 sons is just kind of declared for us and made known. And we're made to stop, take inventory, and realize all that God has done so far. And then verses 27 through 29 concludes this entire Toldot section of Isaac. What has become of Isaac and his generations, his children after him? All that is being told, and it's concluding. And it concludes just as the Toldot of Terah had ended, with the death of the one of the major players. And here we are, the Toldot of Isaac, and it concludes with verses 27 through 29, and verse 29 particularly, the death of Isaac, Jacob's father. And thus it ends. And then chapter 36, verse 1, these are the generations of Esau. And then in chapter 37, verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. And those are the last two Toldot sections in Genesis. We conclude with what became of Esau and then what became of Jacob. And it's interesting that Jacob is well past 100 years old when we begin to ask the question, well, what became of Jacob? It's not so much about them, it's about them and all that they had set up. They'd lived there most of their days, and then now what did they pass on and what became of things from them? And that's how these Toldot sections are set up. Those are roughly the sections of the chapter here in chapter 35. So let's then just work through these sections one at a time, making sure we understand what is happening in each one and what their significance is to us as readers of what God has recorded for us through Moses. So, Genesis 35, verses 1 through 7. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. All right. Again, in this section, God reminds Jacob to fulfill his vow exactly as it had been stated previously. We know that when Jacob purchased the land outside of Shechem 2 chapters earlier and erected an altar there to God, and where he named it El Elohe Israel, God, the mighty God of Israel, right? That he did this in sincerity and with a heart full of thanksgiving to God. And in many ways, he was fulfilling this vow that he had made. He had, there when he was in Bethel before, he said, "If you bring me back safely into this land and you watch after me all the way that I'm going and all the time I'm away, if I get safely back to this land, come back to this place, and safely delivered unto my father's house, I will come back here, and this stone will, right at this place, I will make it a place of worship." Well, God did return him in many ways back to the land. He's back in the land of Canaan. He comes to Shechem, and he's back in some sense to his father's house. Abraham, his grandfather, when he first came into the land, established an altar. The first place he built an altar was there at Shechem. And so he comes to the place at Shechem, it says. And he buys a field. And at the place, he erects an altar, and he names it. And it seems to be that in Jacob's mind, he is in fact fulfilling this vow. Even though he's very well aware that Bethel, some 20 plus miles away, is the actual stone and the place, and yet nonetheless this, where he said he would go and from that place and on that stone, but nonetheless he's genuinely full of thanksgiving to God, and he's genuinely seeking to honor God and fulfill his vow, and he does this, and it seems like it's generally acceptable to God. But sometime later, God says, "Hey, you've never made it to Bethel. You promised me it would be there upon that stone. Remember when you were fleeing for your life from your brother Esau, and you had nothing, and you were going to die, and I've protected you and provided for you and done all these things. You said if I did that, you would go there and fulfill your oath there, and you've never got there. You need to leave, and you need to come there." Now, this is how it begins. God reminds him. So it appears, at least for Jacob, there was at least, even though he was full of sincerity before, there was also an element of knowledge that it's not the same thing precisely that he had promised God he would do. It was genuine, but not complete. Let that be a lesson for us all, right? It was genuine, it was real, but it wasn't complete. God took issue with it in some ways. So now God reminds him of his vow and the specifics of that oath. Let's turn to Genesis 28 and read it once more. Genesis 28, let's read verses 10 through 21. Let's read the whole account there. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! There is none other. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, because but the name of the city was Luz at the first. So the name of the city is Luz, but he has this name that he calls it, Bethel. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So there are some things that perhaps haven't happened. We know certainly he hasn't gotten to Bethel and to do anything at this stone, at this place, and it may be that he hasn't given his tithe yet either. That's very possible. Even though he paid a lot for that field at Shechem, and you could in a way say he was giving that unto God, but he maybe hasn't paid this tithe yet either. Now in this chapter 35, we're not told of any tithe, but if it was yet to be done, we know it would have been done at this time, because he was fulfilling his vow. Now, this is the command God gives him. Now Jacob responds to this reminder and this command from God with a command of his own. That's peculiar, right? I mean, if this is the kind of thing middle management does, right? I mean, the top comes down and say, hey, we need to do this, right? And then, I'm at UPS, so then my boss turns to me and says, hey, you need to do this. And you ask a question, they go, I don't know, we didn't think about that. And they go ask their boss again, right? And they're just kind of stuck. But they receive a command, and so then they pass on that command that they receive. If they're going to perform for those who are commanding them, they have certain expectations they need to put upon those who are they're in charge of. And this is exactly how Jacob responds. God said, get up there, go to Bethel, dwell there, make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, put away those foreign gods that are among you. We got to get rid of them. I can't go and establish anything for God at Bethel if there's all these foreign gods in my camp. I just can't do it. Get rid of them. And purify yourselves. You've not been living the way we should be living before God. And change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, because we're not going the way we are. These things need to be done first. That's so telling. It's clearly, I think, at least an act of purification for worshiping God. We would certainly be justified in asking about these foreign gods and where they might have come from. I have some thoughts on those. Let me give you a couple ideas. First, undoubtedly the foreign gods in the camp, certainly some of them, would have come from these Hivite people captured from the city of Shechem. No doubt, I can't imagine that their empty, vain idols would have done anything but been brought by them as they sought to make the best of being captured and taken by these outsiders. I mean, go do something. What are we going to pray to? Like our life is upside down. Quick, grab the little household idols and trinkets and take them with us and sneak them in if we can. I mean, if Rachel can do it to Laban, surely these people can do it in this city. Surely there are a number of false gods that are there simply because of the people that have been captured and taken and made servants or maybe adopted into families. Second, the sons of Jacob may have been tempted to allow these idols into their home knowingly and may have even been intrigued by them. There was a real danger here of assimilation and syncretism on the part of the sons of Jacob. Think about this. Jacob himself had been uncertain about worshiping God at the first. If God does these things, then I'll serve Him. Well, how much more his sons, right? Certainly his sons were likely to kind of hedge their bets. We already know that they had very little regard for the sacredness of the covenant sign of circumcision. What would keep them from being willing to entertain the idea of these other gods? So maybe they were harboring them as well. Third, we know that at least some of these foreign gods were taken, of these sort of foreign gods, were taken by Rachel from her father Laban. Israel, as a nation, you know, was commanded not to keep those sorts of idols around, as they would certainly lead to false religion and worship. If they had not been destroyed by now, if Rachel's gods that she stole from Laban, if those gods had not been destroyed by now, they were probably being used in some respect by at least someone in the camp of Jacob. Right? If she hasn't divulged that she had stolen these things and they were there, then either she or somebody is kind of using these things still, praying to these things, hedging their bets, not so sure if this God of Jacob is really going to be all he's promised to be. Regardless of who had these idols and these false gods, these foreign gods, as it said, the point is that Jacob knew the current state of his camp and knew that it was not fit for fulfilling the command that God had given him. Part of going up to fulfill the vow was that God alone would be his God. That's what he said. And as the head of his emerging clan, it was his job to ensure that those under his authority and under his leadership were united with him. He could not tolerate a situation where those in his own camp would be worshiping some other god. He has promised God, only God would be his God. And so he's got to make sure there are no false gods. He has to take a stand, a hard line, where he had been a little wishy-washy before, a little easygoing. As long as it wasn't overt, right? You could worship, just don't bring your idol out of the tent. I don't want to see it. Keep it there. He didn't discover after the fact that someone had foreign gods. He knew it and said, put them away. So there was a bit of repentance that happened here for Jacob. In preparation of fulfilling his vow in Bethel, Jacob also commands that the people purify themselves and change their garments. Now, the changing of garments could be a reference to garments of mourning, if these were the family members of the people of these were the survivors of Shechem. The garments could be garments of mourning, and that would not be fit for establishing the worship of God in Bethel to show up with garments of mourning. Change your garments. It could be that. But it's more likely a ceremonial meaning, referring to ritual purification. This would include getting rid of anything associated with other gods, whether jewelry, which we see, maybe clothing, parchments, rituals, certainly your idols. Get rid of it all. We're going to go worship God alone. That's the nature of the command. Then Jacob describes to the people who God is. He says, God is the one who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I've gone. So there's kind of two things to know about God. As Jacob thinks of it, whenever he's been in great distress, he's cried out to God and God has answered him. Every time. But also, everywhere he's gone, God has been directing him, providing for him, working things out in his favor. Right? Looking after him. God has done the things. God has lived up to his end of the bargain. He's done more than enough. And Jacob describes him in this way. It's a little different than what God said. God reminded him, hey, remember when you were running for your life from Esau? Go there. Jacob doesn't say, hey, one time I was running away, fleeing for my life from my brother Esau. He just doesn't say it that way. He words it a different way. He generalizes. Rather than go into the direct fact that Esau was out for blood at one time, he generalizes about that, but then he also explains about God's ongoing faithfulness. Now, I would imagine this would sound, if you were in the camp of Jacob, like it would be both a reminder to his family and to his longtime servants, hey, remember, we've had the help of God. It's right that we go worship him. And also it would be a surprising introduction to God for the newly acquired servants from Shechem. They don't know anything about this God or who he is or what he's like. Their families have just been savagely destroyed and wrecked. They've been taken captive, and now this guy who doesn't seem really approving of what his sons did says, there's this God who has provided for me. Whenever I've been in distress, He has delivered me. We're going to go worship Him. Put your false gods away. We're going to worship this God. I'm not sure how that feels to them. It might feel like hope. Like, here's a God who answers people in distress. When I saw, imagine you're one of the people in Shechem. When I saw these things happening, I grabbed our gods and I prayed that they would deliver us, and nothing happened. And I've still got them, but I don't know why. This guy's telling me, get rid of them. Go worship a God who does answer people in distress. That would be hopeful. But it also might just feel a little high-handed, like it's like the final insult. Like, all I've got left is this, and I got to put it away and go worship your God? I hate you people. Like, that could really be a reality. I'm not sure how it comes across to them. Moses doesn't make much of a point of it, other than they were commanded to do it. And it seems that they do. Verse 4, so they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Not that earrings are pagan, right? They don't have the same connotations that they did then in that culture, but evidently the rings that they had in their ears very much were associated with those false gods. Maybe they were inscribed in some way, or shaped in a certain way, or put in a certain part, or part of some ceremonial ritual, or part of a maturing process. They reach a certain age and they're dedicated to their God, or they wear this thing and that God keeps them safe because it's His sign or whatever. Those sorts of things would have been done. Not all these rings are bad. You remember some of these same patriarchs put a ring in their wife's nose. The world. Like, I'm glad we don't do that. Put a ring on her finger. That's a little more appealing, I think. So nonetheless, these are the culture in which they lived. And so they take these earrings out. And Jacob then hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. He didn't melt them down and create a false idol. He didn't do anything like that. He took them and buried them and hid them. And the word that's used for hid in the ESV, that's a fine translation. It could be translated buried too. There's another word that's usually used for buried, and it's used elsewhere in this text for like a proper burial you would give someone. But this is just like you just put it in the ground. You hid it away, tucked it away so people wouldn't find it. And that's the idea, is he took all their idols and he cut off the people's path to ever return and get those idols again, those false gods. He took them and he hid them there near that tree somewhere. That's the most they would know. It's like, well, I don't know, he went over there somewhere over by that tree, and they're all gone now. And then they go on in their journey. They don't linger around to get clues about where it's at exactly, that kind of thing. He hides them in the ground under this terebinth tree that was near Shechem. He puts it away. The point was to put them out of reach, to cut off forever these idols. Then they set out on their journey to Bethel, a trip of about 20 miles. While on the journey, this caravan that Jacob's leading of people and livestock was very valuable and also very vulnerable, especially as news of their attack had undoubtedly spread to the neighboring Hivite settlements. These would be distant family. There would have been intermarriages that would have happened among these towns. However, rather than sparking outrage and anger, and for this to stir them up to enact revenge when they heard the news, the peoples instead all came under a great fear and dread of Israel. It was as though God Himself had brought this upon them. So great was the fear, and so steadily did it keep them from seeking revenge, they all just stayed in their towns and didn't pursue. This same sort of thing happens later for Israel as they're traveling to the Promised Land. The fear of God came upon them, and they didn't attack Israel. Quite a thing. So as they hear the news about what happened, rather than stirring them up to revenge, they get greatly afraid and they stay put. Now, Jacob then, what happens? He comes to Luz, and Jacob came to Luz, it says. Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. So he comes to this city. It's known later to the people of Israel by the name that Jacob has been giving it, namely Bethel, but now it's called Luz. there at that place, at the very specific place where God had met him previously, he wholly fulfilled his vow to God, built an altar, and renamed the place El Bethel. Last time he was here, he named it, it was Luz, and he called it Bethel. This is the house of God. Now he comes, and notice this subtle difference. I think it's important. The God of the house of God. Instead of just the house of God, now it names it the God of the house of God. It was no longer about an experience in a place. If you remember when we read in chapter 28, it was all about the thing that happened to him in this place and what an amazing place this was. And he didn't know it, and he was in this place, and he didn't realize, and what a remarkable place this is. But now it's about the God who met him and who has faithfully cared for him. He could have just called it the house of God, but he says, the God of the house of God. He renames it. The emphasis is just different. It's more specific, it's more particular, it's more personal, it's more direct. It's not just an amazing place, it's a remarkable God, a faithful God. That's the first section and what happens there. Now, verse 8, there's this emotional loss of Deborah. Now, in this section, Deborah, who is nurse to Jacob's deceased mother, passes away. Now, what do we want to say? Again, remember, Deborah was a nurse to Rebekah when Jacob was born. And so, if you remember the timeline of how old people are here, Deborah's old. Like old. If she was just, let's say, she was just 20 years old when she traveled with Rebekah from Padan Aram. Now, she's likely a little older than 20, but let's just say she's 20. Then she would be 40 when Jacob was born. Because Rebekah was married to Isaac for 20 years before she had any children. So now she's 40. At this time, Jacob, who was born when Deborah was 40, Jacob's over 100. He's not like way over 100, but he's a little over 100. So she's like 140 at a minimum, right? This is crazy. 140 years old. Servants aren't supposed to live that long. I mean, you're kind of making it pretty cush on your servant if they live to be 140. That doesn't happen. She's about 140. There are some people who say she's 180. That I'm aware of, they don't have any evidence for that. I've not seen anything, but that's a tradition. So she's old. She's really, really old. Uncommonly old. Now, think of this. Jacob seems to have never met his mother again after he fled for his life. Right? Remember Jacob, when he fled for his life, his mom says, okay, I'll send word when it's safe. And then, we never hear a word. God's the one who says, get back there. And we never read about any death and burial of Rebekah. We never read that Jacob goes back to see her. Nothing like that. So, it seems, and we talked about this, it seems like Rebekah probably died in the meantime. Like, she would have been, evidently she didn't make it to 140. That's not surprising. But it doesn't seem that she did. So he never met his mother again after he fled for his life. But he does return to visit his father's house at some point that seems not recorded. We're talking here about the journey of his settlements. But it seems like he must have gotten to see his father at some point in order to find Deborah. Because we know Deborah didn't go with him to Padan Aram. He was alone. Or he was mostly alone. And we know that it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely that Deborah heard about his return and asked, Isaac, can I leave and go be with Jacob? Can I live with him? I want to see him again. That's possible, but those kinds of things could have happened. The only other alternative is he got to see his father, Isaac, visited him briefly, and then returned back where he was. Something like that happened. Either way, however we see it, we're reading between the lines a little bit. But somehow he's reunited with Deborah, who was probably a sweet childhood memory and a dear friend from his younger years when he grew up and spent most of his years of his strength. And in his fondness for her, he takes her into his own camp to take care of her. Now, the feeling seems to have been mutual. His affection for her and her affection for him. But his affection for her is clear and evident, as she is one of the only servants mentioned by name in the entire book of Genesis. That's amazing. She's one of the only servants mentioned by name in the book of Genesis. Especially if you don't count Hagar, Zilpah, and Bilhah, if you count them as, because they're kind of servant wives, right? So that's, if you don't count them, we're not talking, I mean, we've got Eliezer, we've got Deborah, and I think that's it. The servants that are mentioned by name. So she's one of the only ones. Now, moreover, her burial is specifically mentioned. We don't read about Eliezer's burial. We don't read about Hagar's burial. We don't read about Bilhah and Zilpah's burials. Why do we read about, we don't read about Rachel's burial. I'm sorry, not Rachel's burial, about Rebekah's burial. But we read about Rebekah's servant, her nurse's burial. This must have been a real strong connection. Not only is the burial place mentioned, it's given a name to recall and to remember it. Right? Elon Bakuth, right? Means oak of weeping. The name itself is a witness to the great affection that Jacob had for her, and perhaps all in the camp had for her. When you think of Deborah, you ought to think about, as old women sometimes do, if they are particularly kind and selfless, and they've gained some wisdom in their years, boy, they have a way of gaining your respect and your affections, don't they? Everybody that knows them just, oh, Deborah. Deborah's great. Oh, Deborah. Nobody has a bad thing to say about Deborah. She's wonderful. Not only is she so great, but look at the life she lives. She's faithfully served my mother or your grandmother all these years. And God has given her such a long life. Deborah. And she dies. And she's buried. And she's remembered by name. And they name the place Oak of Weeping. And there's lamentation made for her there. And the people of Israel know where that place is. Oh, Deborah. And they never met her, but they heard the stories. Deborah. What a thing. The point for Moses, I think, including this, I believe, is first to honor this relationship and the naming of the place that Jacob did and preserve it. But second, it was to demonstrate that losses are piling up here for Jacob. In the midst of fulfilling his vow to God, in the midst of God, and we'll see in a minute, affirming and confirming to him his purposes for him, there is the terrible tragedy that happened at Shechem. There is the loss of this dear friend who's been so close and treasured by him. And we'll see there are more blows to come. But it's all kind of mixed in there together. And I think that's one of the main reasons it's preserved for us, to demonstrate and to lay out there for us the sorrow that he's feeling. And that will continue to build as we go. Now think of this for a moment. All this happens at Shechem. Then God commands him, get up and go, fulfill your vows. Okay, all right, so we're going to go. He goes and he does that. And the next thing that happened is Deborah dies. So we deal with that. We bury her. We set up some kind of memorial for her. We name the place. We honor her. And then God responds. It's not as though he made the offering to God and God just said, okay, remember, this is your name. This is what's going to happen. He fulfills the oath. Then Deborah dies. No word from God came, right? He didn't fulfill the oath and God just said, okay, here it is. Some time passed. So let's pick up in verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. This is what God did. Listen to the way it's characterized. When he came from Paddan Aram. I mean, he's been in the Canaan for years now, but again, as far as God is concerned, you still haven't finished your journey yet. You got to get on here to Bethel, and you've got to get to your father's house, who's in Mamre. And so, God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him, Bethel. Now, in this section, God confirms his promise to Jacob and renaming him Israel. And then Jacob responds. God appears to Jacob again, it says, after the altar was built, after the altar was named, after the vow was completed, after Deborah died, after mourning and lamentation was made for her, now God speaks. And he appears. Specifically, we have an appearance to Jacob. And specifically, it says, it was to bless him. He appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. The singular purpose God has here, to provide a blessing to Jacob and to let Jacob know it. Let's consider this. First, he reaffirms the change of his name. We could say that God had already done this, right? God had already changed his name. And we would be right. But now that Jacob is arriving at Bethel to fulfill his vow, this would be very helpful for you to think of it this way. Both sides are treating it sort of as a fresh start, or as a way to come and officially reaffirm the things that they had previously said to one another and committed to one another. And that's how this scene works. For Jacob, he made religious preparations and purifications for the event, and this called for real change in his camp and in his family. And so now he's ready. Now God then, for his part, is reasserting his authority in Jacob's life. This is your name, I'm naming you something else. He insists on a clean break with the Jacob of old. But also in this name comes not just a demand to change, but also a commitment to Jacob as one who would have the help of God. You're Israel, you're Prince of God, you've prevailed with men, or prevailed with God, now you're going to prevail among men. I'm with you, just as I have been. You'll have my help and my attention in a special way. And then God blesses him again. It says, and God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. That's one way of blessing. Be fruitful and multiply. That sounds familiar in Genesis. What else? A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. And then third, the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. And then it stops. Now in chapter 28, God had specifically said, I'll multiply your descendants as the dust of the earth. You're going to expand north, south, east, west. I'll give you all the land to your descendants after you. And through your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And that's missing here. It's not here. And I want to scratch my head, and I want to put it in there. I want to see it there. I want to say, well, surely he said that, because that's the important thing. The most important part of this is that, and it's left out. And I got to ask, why? What's going on? I really don't like it not being there. That doesn't mean it's not given to him as it already was given to him. I think at this point, either God did not repeat that part, or Moses is not concerned immediately to rehearse that for us. Either way, the point is, I think, that in the midst of Jacob's fear, the threat that others pose to him, the anxiety he has, the uncertainty about all these things, the nations, they were protected on this journey to Bethel, but what's going to come? Because these people are going to be very upset. And in the midst of that threat and uncertainty, God promises him these things. God will establish both Jacob and his descendants in the land. Everything will come to pass. I think that's why the emphasis is all about you, your descendants, greatness in the land. Now God then, having set his peace, it says, immediately went up from him. This is something God has done before once to Abraham. Notice it says that. Verse 13, then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. So God speaks his peace and just, he's out of there. No chance for Jacob to respond. He's just gone. He left. Certainly another way to assert your authority. Tell other people what's going to happen and then leave. There's no rebuttal. There's no argumentation. There's no questioning. There's no response necessary. You've declared what will happen and you're out of there. There's nothing more that needs to happen in this transaction. You need to hear what I'm declaring, and then we're done. It's a lot of authority there. Jacob responds as he should. What does he do? He again sets up a pillar of stone, pours out upon it a drink offering, and then oil. The drink offering would likely have been wine poured out on the pillar as a sign of honor to God for having graciously entered into such a relationship of blessing Jacob, now made Israel. The oil was a way of consecrating the stone for religious purposes. That's the way oil was used. It's consecrated to God, given to him now. And so, in every full sense, Jacob has now being Israel, has fulfilled completely this vow. Then Jacob renames the place Bethel. Wait a minute. He already named this place Bethel years ago, some 30 years ago, right about. He leaves, he comes back, he goes there. God said, get back to Bethel. God said, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. He gets to Bethel, which he's named Bethel. It's called Luz, but he calls it Bethel. He builds this altar and calls it El Bethel, the God of the house of God. Buries Deborah. God meets with him again. He goes through all this with God, and then he names the place Bethel again. It's like, well, what do you mean you name it? Like, it's just an odd thing. Well, it's just a reaffirmation of everything again. Yes, this is in fact the house of God. He said he would establish worship here, and he does. This is it. This is the place where God will be worshipped. And it's just kind of a repeat. They're kind of, fitting everything together, bringing things to a close. This happened. God met him again in this way. And so, yes, in fact, this is the house of God. It's not a mistake or repeated material. It's repeated just like everything else in this passage. It is the intention of both parties to formalize what was already done in the past. All right, now, so that's what happens there. Now, verses 16 through 21, this next section, the birth of Benjamin and the death of Rachel. Then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, which is basically like 90% of the journey still to go, Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for you have another son. And then as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Ani, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. Now, and you see both life, new life, and death here. Both things are hard in their own way. Jacob decides to journey from Bethel on to Hebron, on to Mamre, but they don't make it very far before they have to stop. We learn that Rachel was pregnant again. That's something we learn, like as we read, and Rachel went into labor. Like, what? I didn't know she was pregnant. Surprise, right? She's pregnant, and she's in hard labor. This is not a good time to be in hard labor, right? Possibly one of the reasons the labor is so hard. You're traveling on this journey. Timing isn't great. They have to stop. She's pregnant again, some 15 years or so since her only child Joseph had been born. You might remember her previously saying to Jacob, "Give me children or I die." Remember that? She comes to him and says, "Give me children or I die." She says, "Am I God?" Well, it's more than a little ironic that now that she finally gets children, she dies. She thought I could have children or die. Once she finally got children, she died in childbirth. That was it. Right? She didn't get to enjoy having children. As soon as she had the second child, she died. Moreover, this is a bit sobering, you might remember Jacob's word to Laban. When Laban was searching Jacob's camp for his stolen gods, Jacob said, "Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live." It's possible that it wasn't until very recently that it came out that Rachel had in fact stolen the gods. She's with child. She doesn't die. No one puts her to death until God does after the child is born. Very possible. Moses doesn't make a point of it. But these things are all listed there in the text. You start putting these things together. It's very possible that this was coming true. Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. Her labor was hard. So hard to the point that it ended up taking her life. But when the labor, we read, was at its worst, was at its hardest, and almost complete, her midwife was encouraging her with the news that she was giving birth to a son. That happens several times in the Bible. Some woman is in hard labor, and the midwife says, "Be encouraged, you're having a boy." Poor girls, right? I don't know. I mean, having a boy meant something more in those cultures. None of us deny that. So it'd be another, good on you, right? At least you're having a boy. I don't know. I love my daughters. I don't love them more than my sons, but there were reasons of social honor and financial security and military security why it was far better in those harsher days to have a son if you're only going to have one more. So rejoice. She's got a boy. Right? And the child was born. She called him Ben-Ani, meaning son of my sorrow. There's some debate among scholars as to exactly what this means, but it's generally a consensus. In other words, there are some other options, all of which are not great, but none of them surpass this one. Everybody's kind of in agreement. That's probably it, but this other thing's maybe possible, or that's possible. There's a couple other alternatives. All of them are negative. Some of them are real stretches, but generally accepted means simply this: son of my sorrow. Right? Some of you might have, or son of my strength. And then the idea there would be like you've taken it all. It's just gone. This is it. But Israel would not have it. Notice his name is actually changed this time. Before, God changed his name and the text kept calling him Jacob. And now it's Israel, 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 Israel. Something's final about all this. It's official. It's formalized. So now, we have sometimes, we have Jacob set up a pillar, but again and again it's Israel, Israel, Israel. Now, so Rachel died and she was, okay, so anyway, but his father called him Benjamin. He didn't stand for this. He called him Benjamin. He wouldn't have that name. He had far higher hopes for this boy than to carry around such a sullen name. Wouldn't be shouldered with that for his life. He named him instead son of my right hand. Right? Son of my right hand. If Joseph, think of this, if Joseph was already favored, as we later learn, then Benjamin also would be favored, especially with a name like son of my right hand. Son of my right hand. All the hopes for Benjamin. If Joseph was loved, we're told in the next chapter, because he was the son of Jacob's old age, and he's just, like a year younger than the next son, how much more Benjamin, born some 15 years later? the son of his old age. He's going to be loved. I mean, Joseph is favored among the 11, but Benjamin, number 12, son of my right hand, who I will not let be shouldered with the burden that his mother died giving birth to him. The one wife I loved, what she left me was this child, son of my right hand. So you see the favoritism there. It's just like it's started. It's already there. Well, this has been an eventful trip indeed so far, both a birth and a death. They've hardly gotten anywhere. They did not return to Bethel to bury Rachel, which to me seems odd. They weren't very far. Why not take her back? Instead, they just bury her on their way. Seems pretty unceremonious. And so Jacob sets up, though, a lasting pillar over her tomb. I say lasting because it tells us it is the pillar of Rachel's tomb which is there to this day. It's still there. Now, that doesn't hold true necessarily for us as we read it, but as Moses wrote it, as the nation of Israel was preparing to go into the land, or perhaps even as other people, as the nation of Israel had gotten into the land, we've mentioned before that sometimes some of these texts in Genesis were edited by later scribes in Israel under the guidance of God. It's very possible one of them wrote that. It's still there, guys. Still here. Very possible. But it lasts for a long time. The people of Israel would know this place once they'd gotten into the land. So then Jacob continues on his way. He makes it as far as the Tower of Eder, where he pitched his tent for what was probably at least a few weeks. It says he pitched his tent. He pitched his tent beyond. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. While Israel lived in that land, while he's there near the Tower of Eder, or beyond the Tower of Eder, this is the next section, this shocking event, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. This verse is among a few verses, not many, but a few verses, a few sections of Scripture that the Jewish rabbis, when they would teach, they'd read from the Hebrew Scriptures and then they would translate and teach in the native tongue of the people, the common tongue. They wouldn't translate this verse. They would just read it in the original and they wouldn't go on and talk about it. That's something, isn't it? It's like you don't touch this one. You don't want to talk about it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, we're going to talk about it at least a little bit, right? I'll try to be delicate. In this section, this is not an account of a lustful escapade. It's not the point. Reuben makes a play again to secure his position among his brothers rather than leaving it to Isaac to decide. Not a lustful action, it was a calculated and political action. Israel, we know, was the patriarch of the family. No doubt Reuben, who was his firstborn, was in line for the firstborn's inheritance and the firstborn's blessing. He would receive the double portion of the inheritance, and usually that would include inheriting the servants of his father. The concubines of Jacob, Bilhah and Zilpah, would typically then, upon Jacob's death, pass to Reuben. What Reuben does with them is up to him, but they would pass on as property, as servants, as inheritance to the oldest. So they're coming to him. However, if someone wanted to establish their right to rule and to usurp it, to take it away from the one who was in charge, there were several ways to do that. You could just fight them. You could kill them. You could try to gain everyone's allegiance politically and just make it where they don't have any followers. Or you could take control of the patriarchs or the king's harem, those women who belonged to him as concubines or wives. Take control. This was a lewd and a coarse way of doing that, but it was something that was done. It was done in Israel. There are other instances in the Bible where this exact thing happens, and it's always a political play. It's never about, I really am attracted to that woman. That's never what it's about. It's always a political play. If you would do this, it would have definite connotations about a statement being made to the rest of the encampment or to the rest of the kingdom that the current king no longer has enough vitality and enough virility to lead the people any longer. They served their time of usefulness and should no longer be considered worthy of the position that they held as king or patriarch or ruler. After all, they can't even keep their women, their harem. They've come to me instead. They're mine. This would be considered a tremendous insult to the leader, so that it immediately invokes a conflict. Either there's an outright conflict, or you just submit and say, you're right, you're in charge. It's that kind of thing, typically, what would be done. Everyone would say, whoa, did you see what he did? Did you see that insult? And he didn't do anything about it? Okay, I guess this guy's in charge now. That's the way this is meant to play out. There's also, so this happens several times in the Bible. I won't get into all those, but I'll just mention 3 times I think of. Abner attempts it with Saul's concubines in 2 Samuel 3. Absalom attempts to do this in 2 Samuel 16. And Adonijah attempts to do it with David's harem in 1 Kings 2. All around the same time in history, one from another, not too far removed. But we have 3 instances in the Bible where this is specifically said. Isn't it interesting? When who's in charge is up in the air, that's when this kind of thing starts happening. And so here is Reuben. So you might say Reuben's looking around at his father and saying, this guy, look what happened to our sister. He didn't take the lead in this. He left it to us. I'm the firstborn. You know, my 2 younger brothers, we didn't do anything. We were going to go, we had this plan. My 2 younger brothers stood up for the honor of our sister, and they slew those men, and good on them, because those guys deserved it. And Dad had a problem with it. I disagree. He's wrong. Now he's taking us from there. Now we're up in Bethel doing all this stuff. Look, I'm in charge, and I'm going to prove it. And he goes, no, nothing's said about him raping Bilhah. So I think evidently he persuades Bilhah. He's right. Jacob's time is done. And so he takes her. Reuben also may have had more motivation. Think of this. There's a possible concern that Bilhah would take, who was Rachel's servant, now that Rachel has died. Leah has always been hated and unloved. You don't suppose that this servant concubine woman would usurp Leah's place and become now the favorite instead of Leah? Can't have it. How could you make sure that that would never happen, that he would never be content to have Bilhah be the favored wife? You could take her as your own. And then he would never take her back. He couldn't. So you could spoil the whole thing that way too and preserve some honor for your mother. There's all kinds of things. He's been seeing favoritism worked out his whole life. There's another way to put an end to that real quick. So the result here was not what he thought. I think he anticipated Israel would step down as leader. But instead, Israel heard of it, knew of it, and the whole thing was found out. And evidently, Reuben did not have the full support of his brothers because people continue to follow Israel as the leader. It just didn't work. He's just put to shame now. You did this shameful thing, and the thing you thought you were going to gain, you didn't get. You just acted in a way that's disgraceful. Instead, he merely drew the ire and the anger of his father, which manifests itself later in Genesis and even later in Chronicles. But in Genesis, and I'll just read it, chapter 49, verse 2, or verse 3, well, verse 2. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. He's pronouncing his blessings on them. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Like you thought this is what you were to be. No. Verse 4, unstable as water. You shall not have preeminence, because when you went up to your father's bed, and then you defiled it. And he turns to others, he went up to my couch. Think of that. That's what he says. He's not forgotten. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength. You are to be preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water. You shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul not come into their counsel. Whew, it's not good. Not starting out good. It's an awful thing. It's shocking what Reuben does. Israel heard of it. It didn't work. All right, now, verses 22b through 26. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. Now they're mentioned not by birth order, but by whose sons they are, who was their mother. And curiously, it starts with Leah, then Rachel's servant, then Leah's servant. Kind of an odd approach here, because that's not the order they were born in at all. Even though for each woman, her children are listed in order of their birth order. So all of Leah's children are listed from oldest to youngest, or all of her sons. Notice Dinah is not mentioned again. She's just left out. The sons of Jacob were 12. That's what we're talking about. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, right? It specifically tells us that. Reuben just made this play. He was the firstborn. That's why he was making that play. Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Okay, this is the 12 sons of Israel, the seedling clan that would become a nation. One question. Were they all born in Paddan Aram? Anyone? The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Not born in Paddan Aram. It's a really strange, we know he wasn't born in Paddan Aram. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. The sense I can make of that is Moses is speaking about Jacob's journey just as God has been speaking about it, and that is he's still on his way back from Paddan Aram. He hasn't settled yet in the land of Canaan, which he does later when he gets to Hebron. So into Mamre. So it's the only sense I can make of it. Now let's go on to verses 27 and 29. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. And now we fast forward all the way to the end of Isaac's life. We're closing things down. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Right? His sons Esau and Jacob buried him. The reunion of Esau and Jacob for this event is striking. It's not surprising, as they seem to have made peace with one another, but it's striking that you see it here. It's surprising that they came in this way. They don't seem to have much else to do with each other. Certainly in the told out section of Esau, there's nothing really mentioned about Jacob, and likewise in Jacob's about Esau. It says he's gathered to his people, old and full of days, just like he lived a good life. God took care of him. Last time we really saw him was when he sent Jacob away. And now here he is, he's old and full of days, gathered to his people, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now, that's the chapter. Now let me give some perspective and application, and we'll close this down. having ended this toldot section. Remember that these toldot sections function, each one of them has at least one main thrust, one main question. We read in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And at the end of that whole account is done, and it says, now this is the generations of the heaven and the earth, when the day the Lord God created the earth and the heavens. What happened to them? Because they're not like what we read. And the whole section is about that. And it ends with Adam and Eve being expelled. And it says, well, what happened to Adam then? What happened to mankind in this world? Living apart from God in some ways. And Moses goes on to explain. And then we get to another toldot section, and another, and another. And we're closing down a toldot section. So we ought to have some answers to some questions. Now's a good time to pause, reflect. What's happened? Right? So this toldot section begins here in chapter 25, verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Children struggled within her. And so this is how it begins. So we saw what happened, how Terah, the toldot of Terah ends with Abraham and all these mighty things God was promising Abraham. And that closes, and it was okay, he's got his son Isaac that was promised. What's going to happen to Isaac? What comes from Isaac? Well, his wife was barren, but he was praying to God. And God heard his prayer and gave his wife twins. But it wasn't good. Whew, it was bad. There are all these problems. And so the question is, well, what's going to come of all this? This isn't good. There's a war, and there's going to be division and hostility, and older serving the younger. This is a big problem. Well, the way it works out, it took a long way, but God had worked in Jacob's life in such a way that at the end of this section, Jacob is sold out for the Lord. His name is Israel. He's made all these monuments and altars to God in the place. There's so much more that's going on. It's not just one child for another generation again. There's 12 sons. He's got 12. Now they got their problems and there's been issues, but we have 12. We have a patriarch in charge. In spite of what Reuben tried, Israel's still in charge of the family. He's going hard for God. He's leading the way, and he's got 12 sons who are after him. Things are looking a lot better than they were when Abraham and Sarah were barren. They're looking a lot better than when Isaac's wife was barren, and he's praying, God, please provide us a child. And for 20 years this goes on, right? Things are looking good. In spite of all the negatives, in spite of the hardship, in spite of the dying and all these things that happen, different ones are just off the stage now. I mean, Isaac is just dead. There's nothing more to tell me about Isaac. He's gone. It's gone. So what became of him? Well, what became of him is Jacob, this man of God, prince of God. That's where we are now. We've got a prince. God's got a man on the earth. His name's Israel. And he's leading this misfit bunch of sons that he has. He's not doing it perfectly, but he's going for God. He's standing for God in this place. He's established the worship of God there at Bethel. We have seen chapter after chapter of God's faithfulness and His mighty protection and determination to teach and to earn the love and trust of those whom He calls. He had no need to earn the love and trust of Jacob. Jacob should have given it to him. But God delights to strengthen our weak confidence by repeated promises, by answers to desperate prayers, by surprising deliverances, such that we call God the mighty God who delivered us when we called. Now that Jacob is a true worshiper of God in sincerity and truth, yes, his family has issues to be sure, but God is more than capable of dealing with that. After all, He dealt with Jacob. What we know at the end of this Toldot section is that the family is growing, is prospering, is currently led by one who has a singular desire to honor God, and who is awaiting an everlasting kingdom, that place and that descendant that cannot be shaken. That's what he's waiting on. This is good. It's not perfect. Certainly not perfect, but this is good. Things are better. Wouldn't we all agree? I mean, things are better off now than they were when they started this section. God's carrying things forward for all the back and forth, for all the deception and the lies that happened from one side to the other, and the deliverances that God had to work. It's better. I want to read this quote from John Walton, who's just said things better than I could have. Genesis 35 draws the Jacob narrative to its climax. What is the state of the covenant? Number 1, Jacob has returned to the land. Number 2, he has disposed of other gods, suggesting a commitment of allegiance to Yahweh. Number 3, Yahweh has exerted his authority over Jacob by changing his name to Israel and has reiterated the covenant blessing to him. Number 4, Jacob has established 2 more foundations in the land, the altar and the pillar at Bethel and Rachel's tomb. 5, the family has continued to expand and can now be considered as a recognizable clan, independent and settled, despite the serious threat from the Hivites that nearly scuttled it. What else does he say? Sometimes progress is so slow and hampered that we can fail to notice the gradual progress being made. Genesis 35 provides an opportunity for the reader to take stock of how far the ancestors have come. 200 years and 23 chapters into this covenant experience, find everything still intact, though there has been no shortage of scrapes and bruises along the way. A dozen times the covenant has dangled by a single thread, but God is faithful and sovereign, and His grace is sufficient. Personally, Jacob has emerged to take his rightful place among his forefathers as a man of faith. Regardless of what spiritual shortcomings may have been exposed in his vow, and regardless of the dangers that accompany the vow, Jacob has fulfilled it. And the vow stands as a testimony to his commitment to Yahweh. God's patient work in his life has resulted in a transformation of character that may have seemed beyond reach in the earlier chapters. End quote. Let me finish with this, just an exhortation here. Beloved, my conviction is that we are to come to the end of this Toldot section of Genesis, take stock of these remarkable changes, together with the great setbacks, and put it all in a ledger, if you like, and lay that record down on a sheet of paper. Then on the other side of the paper, record the recent history of your own life. Right? If you're a believer, you'll find remarkable similarities. The good and the bad, sort of all mixed in there together. You also are being summoned by God to lay aside your former manner of life and those things besides God, which you have held in reserve for some sort of a backup, hope, and confidence. You also have come to God in genuine worship and surrender. You've been brought under the absolute authority of God and have been given a new name between you and God alone. And that name and that purpose has been reaffirmed to you again and again as a Christian between you and God. You've come to this moment in time right now, I can say this about all of us, riding a wave of God's blessing and provision. It will continue to carry you right on through those other things that are in the way now. It's moving you faster and higher and more powerfully than you could ever move yourself. You just weren't going to get there. The next step in your sanctification is just never going to happen apart from God putting you on this wave and carrying you through, bringing obstacles in your life that you don't want to anticipate. They've got to be there. This is His way. And yet there have also been and continue to be a scary number of obstacles to the things that God has promised, such that there's no small degree of fear and concern within you about how all of this will turn out and about how much more pain and more failure it's going to involve. This is Jacob's life right now. This is Israel, and this is you. Beloved, God is faithful in all of this. Progress is in fact being made. He's saving His people. He's building a holy temple, creating a royal nation of priests, bringing His blessing to all the families of the earth. My point is that a fair and honest assessment of our circumstances and of our real progress in this life with God is often a very helpful, healthy, and hopeful exercise. This Toldot section of Isaac ends, and even after the sin of Reuben, it reminds us just how much further along the promise is than in the previous generation. God's at work even in those days. He's at work even in these days. And I'll say this just personally, just directly to us as a church. We are, as a church, in the very midst of a number of very hard things. Some of us are near to despairing of life itself, as Paul brings out. And on a horizontal level, there's every reason for that, for just despair. Like there doesn't appear to be a good way out of a number of the situations that are happening in this church, in the lives of those people that are here. That's just the reality. And yet, beloved, the grace of God is so very active, and active in these specific circumstances. His kingdom is here among us, in our midst. Now, I don't want to put all these details out there on the internet as we're recorded, but beloved, you know the kinds of things I'm speaking about. We have prayed and labored for some of these souls. God has heard us in some cases. Other people we've been praying for that just recently passed on. Others are who are near to us in these overwhelming circumstances also weigh us down with worry. But underneath the surface, or we might say above the surface, the Spirit of God is what? Moving, stirring the waters. Active, moving in ways we don't see and realize. Such that we will look back in 20 years, those of us who are here, and bless God for all that He is doing in our lives right now in these days. That'll happen. We don't see it now. Right now, there's too much. We're just dealing with stuff that are in front of us. Sometimes it feels like God's far off, but He's here right now in the midst, just like He was with Jacob, with Israel. There was so much that was going wrong, and yet there was so much progress being made. The very sons He could look at and say, what a disaster, were in fact themselves testimonies to God's faithfulness. He wouldn't have said it that way, but that's the reality. We can look back and see it now, but he couldn't see it then. We will see that this kingdom and these promises that He has made us have been faithfully carried out by God all the way through. We'll rise up and call in blessing. We just will. Be encouraged, beloved. God's with us. We, like Israel, have been overtaken by God. We have come to plead with Him, and our pleadings for His blessing have prevailed. And because of His love for us and His purpose of redemption for us, we now prevail in the world. We overcome. And that's the reality. That's my exhortation today.